Welcome to season 7, Sal Silvester on the Future of Leadership. I am Sal Silvester, your host and executive producer of this podcast. I'm thrilled to be with you this season. Season 7 is focused on elevating human performance at work. We are exploring what leaders can do to help themselves and others improve their performance at work. And the analogy that always comes to mind for me this season is athletes train for events using tried and tested methods to enhance their performance. Why wouldn't we do the same at work? So today we're focusing on learning, barriers to truth, asking the right questions, and creating focus, all as a means to improve your performance. My special guest today, Willie Pietersen. He's a renowned expert in leadership with a wealth of experience across both business and academia. Willie served as the CEO of multiple global companies, including Lever Brothers Foods Division, Seagram USA, Tropicana, and Sterling Winthrop's Consumer Health Group. He is currently a professor of the practice of management at Columbia Business School. He specializes in strategy and the leadership of change, and his methods and ideas, especially strategic learning, are widely applied within Columbia's executive education programs and is also in numerous corporations. His most recent book is Leadership, the Inside Story, and we're going to be focusing on some critical topics inside of Leadership, the Inside Story that will help improve your performance at work. Let's go to the interview with Willie now. A hallmark of effective leaders is that they're lifelong learners. Success is not bestowed on us. We must learn our way there. Talk to me about your perspective here, Willie.
You know, it's an interesting fact of life that sometimes we have freedom of choice, at other times we're bound by laws that we can't escape. One of those laws, for example, is gravity. If we throw a ball up in the air, we can't just make the choice that it will stay up there. Laws of gravity tell us the ball will fall down. And evolutionary science is a law. It's not a choice. And I think Charles Darwin made a gigantic leap forward in the understanding of survival in his majestic book, Origin of Species, written in 1859. It really changed our understanding of biology and the necessity of being able to adapt successfully to the external environment in order to survive. Now, in nature, these adaptations occur, on a random, unthinking, blind basis. And it's true that any species in nature that fails to generate favorable variations will eventually become extinct. Now, that's a law. You can't change it. It's the way the world works.
Yeah.
And it made me think about how human organizations and individuals also need to contend with changes in the external environment and adapt successfully. And if we can't adapt successfully, we're going to fall behind as an organization in a competitive world and probably not survive for very long. In fact, the survival rate for organizations based on the S&P 500 is not very impressive. It's about half of a human life. Well, that's a rather poor performance. So I started to develop this notion that organizations, just like organisms in nature, need to develop the capacity to learn continuously about the external environment and create processes to adapt successfully to those changes. And the big thing I think we need to take on board here is that the external environment will not adapt to us and what we are trying to do. We have to adapt to the external environment and the demands that places on us to be able to survive over the long term. And I think the most important responsibility of leaders is to maintain the long-term sustainability of their organizations. And that is not based on the number of years that it's existed. It's based on its adaptive capacity. So that's that philosophy that you're quoting from.
Yeah, I love that. It's really not our strength, it's our ability to adapt that enables our survival, whether it's evolutionary or organizational, is the argument
Yes.
that you're making in your book, Leadership, The Inside Story. What are some practices or habits that you recommend for leaders to cultivate that continuous learning and adaptation, whether it's for themselves or for their teams?
Margaret Wheatley made a very profound statement about learning. She said, "You cannot change a living thing from the outside. You can only disturb it so that it changes itself."
Mm.
And I think as leaders, we need to invite the disturbances into our lives in order to change ourselves, to be able to adapt successfully. And if we can't do that as individual leaders in organizations and teach our organizations to do that, it's not going to work very well. We can't ask our organizations and give them hardwired processes for continuous learning and adaptation if we are not role models and sort of showing the way ourselves as leaders. Now, here's the interesting thing. It puts a burden on us to be lifelong learners. Now, that's true, I think, for the reasons we've discussed. But at the end of the day, we don't really know how we learn. We learn kind of, just subconsciously. We take on things. That's interesting. That's interesting. But how do we cultivate that habit of ongoing learning? What habits do we need to instill in our daily lives in order to be able to do that? And I think we need a process. Now, I think the process for individual learning is similar to the process for organizational learning. And for organizational learning and adaptation, I've got this process, which I describe in my book, called strategic learning.
Yeah.
It has 4 steps. First step is to learn by conducting a situation analysis, if you like, by looking at the external environment, the changes that are occurring in the external environment, be deliberate in terms of that exploration. And that learning is driven by asking good, penetrating questions. From there, we say, well, having learned that, what should we focus on? What are the choices we need to make in order to compete effectively in the external environment? And the third step is to align the total system, the total organization behind this. And then finally, we execute. Now, I'll make an admission here. I read very few business books.
Mm-hmm.
I read very widely in the sort of spirit of inquiry, inviting those disturbances into my learning process. And I keep a learning journal so that I capture my learning in an explicit kind of way. The 3 big topics outside of business literature, I do read some books and I do study some of them very deeply. Some of them are outstanding. And I skim through a lot of others. But that's about maybe 25% of my reading. Mm-hmm. So philosophy, evolutionary science, which we've discussed already, really understanding that element. And astrophysics, for me, is really an interesting topic. All of these have informed my own approach, my own philosophy of leadership. Mm. Now, if you just go back, just briefly look at some of these in philosophy. But the reason I really like philosophy is that it helps us answer the 3 big questions in our lives. One is, what's true? The second is, what's important amongst everything that's true? And the third is, what's right? What's important, what's true, what's important, and what's right? And then, interestingly enough, when we think about ethical behavior, Plato gave us a definition of ethics over 2,000 years ago that nobody's improved on. He defined it in very simple ways by saying ethical behavior is acting in the common interest, regardless of who is watching, without the expectation of a reward and without the fear of punishment. Now, I sometimes teach a little session on ethics. I put that up on a screen and I say to people, can you improve on that? And nobody can.
Right.
So I like philosophy for that reason. Nice. It fills us with that kind of wisdom. Astrophysics, if I go there for a minute, the reason I really like it is because it puts us in our place. It makes us humble. It makes us understand our own insignificance,
Right.
the fact that
Right.
our lives are transient and short. But it reminds us of something really, really important. We have just enough time to make a difference.
Mm.
But that time period is not unlimited. So those are things that have, informed my thinking. Ray Bradbury, he was a science fiction writer, made a statement that I wrote in my learning journal. We are born to be the witness to the wonders of the universe, to understand where we fit in, who we are, and what's important.
Mm.
Those are the things that I think we learn from astrophysics, biggest subject in the world. Now, so that's what's made my own learning deliberate and purposeful. And I believe strongly in the learning journal to write down what we've learned that deepens our learning. I started this habit when I was 16 years old. I've now got a pile of them sitting on a shelf over there.
Wow, that's cool.
And I regularly retrieve and think about those learnings. I sometimes chuckle at the things I wrote down when I was in my early 20s and so on, when the world has changed so much. That's what I think we all need to think about, is how do we create a deliberate learning process for ourselves?
Yes. The ability to monitor our own thinking will arm us with the mental bulldozers to overcome our ingrained biases.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, the world has become a lot more complex. It's changing more rapidly. Decision-making has become harder than it's ever been before, wrestling with complexity in this kind of way. Just for example, artificial intelligence now lies at our door, and if we can't really master what it needs to do for us as a very valuable tool, we can fall behind. The world has become much more complex. So critical thinking becomes crucial here in terms of solving problems and making really great purposeful decisions in our organizations. Now, there's something that gets in the way of critical thinking. It gets in the way for all of us. None of us is immune. We all have inbuilt biases. I call them barriers to truth.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing for me is that one of the biggest biases that we all harbor is the belief that everybody else is biased, but not us. If you think about political parties, I mean, this is our tribe. We believe in this. Everybody else is wrong and biased, right? Well, the truth is nobody's immune. So the secret is to develop an acute awareness of our own biases, to monitor our own thinking. The only antidote to biases is awareness, because they're unconscious biases. We don't run around saying, by the way, I'm having a conversation, and while I do it, this is bias number one, bias number two. I hope you'll forgive me. We don't talk that way.
Right.
They are hidden from ourselves. They're subconscious. So making them explicit, I think, is important. And there are four that I particularly put a focus on because they are really very prominent and disruptive to our own thinking. Develop an awareness of them. There's the confirmation bias, strongest of all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the tendency we all share to come to an issue with a preconceived idea of what's true and selectively look for evidence to confirm what we already believe. We don't approach problems with a blank slate. We weren't born yesterday, as the saying goes.
Right.
We've got a worldview. We tend to lead our thinking with that worldview. Now, the world is changing very rapidly. We can't start with yesterday's logic. So we need to be aware of that one. And then, of course, there is the status quo bias, which can, cause enormous damage. I just mentioned one quick example because it's so stunning. It's not a matter of having a superior IQ. The brightest people in the world are subject to status quo bias and these other biases. The example I offer is Kodak, who at one stage was an American icon, probably a worldwide icon.
Right.
Massive leader in photography, and photographic film. And they look invincible. At one stage, they were the fifth most valuable brand in the world.
Mm.
And but they went broke. And you say, well, how could that happen? After 132 years, by the way, they went broke. And you say, well, why did that happen? Well, they were overtaken by digital photography. Oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense as a disruptor. And the next question is, who invented digital photography? Who did this to Kodak? Kodak invented digital photography. They did it to themselves. Now, the story is, and there was an interview in the New York Times we can draw on, which I drew on in writing this chapter in my book. An engineer in Kodak called Mike Sasson invented digital photography. He presented that to the leadership team. He was very taken and very excited by it. And of course, the executive team was rather alarmed at the prospect of cannibalizing their own business. And so we're reluctant to take it on. And so the story goes, and he said this in the interview, and I'm quoting him. They said, Mike, that's a cute idea, but don't tell anybody. Right. He didn't tell anybody, and they went broke. Now, that is, the status quo bias showing how it can actually destroy a major corporation. And these were not stupid people. They tried to hire the best people they could. And so it goes on. And one of the other ones that comes up regularly is siloed thinking.
Yes.
We have functions in organizations for a very important reason. We need to have certain areas of expertise that contribute to success if they work in combination. It's a bit like a soccer team, or if people are playing wing, center forward, half back, goalie. If each one plays their own game, that's not a winning team. You need to have a game plan, and they work in combination. The trouble is the thinking becomes tribal, and each one develops a kind of a pattern of thinking about what matters. Here's my contribution to it. It's more important than your contribution to it, etc. And you get internal competition, which is absorbing resources, as opposed to the competition outside. So that shows up, and often it shows up for customers who are expecting integrated solutions, and they're getting certain people saying, that's not my job. I'm sorry, that's somebody else's job. Well, your job is to bring the team effort to the client, right? So it shows up regularly there as well. So if we become aware of this, we can monitor our own thinking, and we can help our teams. I think it's a good idea before embarking on any kind of strategy process to sit down as a team and say, let's develop an awareness of these biases that it can interfere with our critical thinking capabilities. Do it in a friendly way, call out each other and monitor our own thinking, and that will become a lot better at problem solving.
I love that. You mentioned, I think the fourth area, denial. People are motivated to avoid pain. And it reminds me of a quote that I don't even know where it comes from, but it's been really powerful for me in my life, which is all progress begins with the truth. And there's an element here of, if you're denying the truth, it's hard to put those, it's hard to grow from those disruptors that are entering your life.
So the interesting thing is the truth is hard to discern. The world is very complicated. And Nietzsche, the German philosopher, made the comment that there are no facts, there are only interpretations. So you're absolutely right. But arriving at the truth, that's why this philosophy for me always starts, what's true?
Right.
What's important? There's the interpretation, right? And then what's right? And then, what we wrestle with most strongly is choices between right and right. Between right and wrong are very easy. But, between two things, both of them are right. Which one should we do? Then we loop back to what's important. So it's this interpretive skill that enables us. I've been on a committee at Columbia. I hate committees. I don't know about you, but I was asked to serve on this committee to look at some of the academic practices. Let's just call them that, right? And we were given a flood of data, the committee. And the extraordinary thing for me, each one was given a different task to look at. And each of us looked at different slices of this. It's a bit like the blind man and the elephant, right? And each of us said, well, if I look at this or that aspect of it, it tells me this truth. And this is influential in terms of our conclusion. And somebody else will say, well, yes, that's interesting, but I looked at this data, I looked at it this way, and that actually conflicts with your conclusion. So there we had this kind of debate about what's really important on the data. How can we interpret it and find ground truth, so to speak, right? It's what the military call the fog of war.
Yes. Yeah. You mentioned in the book, asking the right question can transform the understanding of a problem and change the course of events.
Yes, everything we know comes from a question somebody asked. Literally, it's true. Everything we know in science and in general knowledge came from a question. It didn't just fall out of the blue sky. And I think a crucial capability for leaders is the capacity to ask great questions, inviting questions, not questions that trap people's ignorance and so on, because that's the way we learn effectively for ourselves and in groups. Now, there are a number of examples of what good questions look like and how they can really influence the outcome of events, as you say. The most dramatic one that I mentioned in the book, and I'll mention it now, is an example from American history. For the listeners who are not American, forgive me for this example, but it came from the Revolutionary War. It was fought in the 18th century by American rebels against the British occupying forces. At that stage, there were 13 separate colonies pulled together by George Washington. They each had their separate militias. So we had a ragtag army. They didn't even have the same uniforms. And they embarked on this war of independence against the most formidable army that existed at the time, the British military system. And not surprisingly, in the early stages of the war, they were on the back foot. They were in a dire situation, and it looked very depressing. And according to the diaries that the historians have uncovered, Washington sat down with these senior officers and said, we're losing at the moment, and we have to turn this around. And he posed a question. And the question was, how can we defeat the British? Well, a lot of ideas came out from that discussion, and each one was seen to be completely impractical, impossible, and with their meager resources, they were completely overmatched by the British Army. None of those things were possible, and it looked like an impossible situation until one of the officers, eventually, after tussling with this issue, intense mental engagement, he eventually said, I think we're asking the wrong question. I think the right question is, how can we avoid losing? Now, that simple question led to a breakthrough in their military strategy. They embarked on surprise commando raids on the British columns, unconventional warfare at the time. But the British thought, play fair. It should be just a sort of a confrontation of two forces. But they did this. They harassed the British forces continuously and quick withdrawals before taking losses. And the theory was, we'll exhaust the British and eventually they will go home. And it worked with the help of the French, as you know, in the final push.
Yes.
And literally, that was the question that won a war.
You mentioned the after action review. So I was really pleased to see that in your book, because we teach those 4 questions when we're teaching coaching. It's such a great set of questions that is, it's a great coaching conversation. 4 questions, and the way that we tend to frame it. What did you intend to do? What actually happened? And you look for that gap between those 2 questions. What did you learn? And what's next? Tell me about your perspective on those 4 questions.
Well, they came from the military, as you well know. After every engagement in the military, there's this practice of doing an after-action review. It's very rigorous, and it takes a lot of skill to conduct it in such a way that you extract honest answers, because things typically don't go 100% right. Mistakes get made, and there's a temptation, of course, to blame rather than to learn. So the question is, how do you shift that needle from blaming? When you blame, people bury mistakes and you don't learn anything. How do you shift the needle from blaming to learning? So they do this after every engagement. And I've done a regular number of workshops at the Army War College in Carlisle in Pennsylvania.
Oh, very cool.
Executives there, yeah. It's been exciting. I haven't done them recently, but over a number of years, I took groups of executives, and we were taught how to do an after-action review. There was a Colonel Campbell, who would conduct them with us on a scenario that he would describe, and he was very strict. We'd offer something, and he'd say, "That's not a useful answer, go again," etc. And you really learn how to do this well. So it's made a big difference to military capability in a changing world. The airlines had a very bad time during the 1990s with a lot of airplane crashes and mishaps. And flying literally became a little kind of dodgy. So something needed to be done. And the airline industry picked up this learning practice. What was meant to happen? What actually happened? Why did it happen? How can we do better next time? Applied a similar learning process. You had to report near misses. Previously, there was no reporting system for near misses, but it was done without blame. It was so, all right, there was a near miss. What did you learn? I mean, just saying there was a near miss, I'm sorry, there was a near miss, and there's no learning. Well, you're going to do near misses in future, and it'll become hits eventually. And you know what happened is, from that rather dismal record in the 1990s, in the next 15 years, looking just at American carriers, they carried 8 billion passengers, that's equivalent to the world population, without one single fatality.
Wow.
Now, that's a remarkable turnaround and a remarkable testament to the power of doing after-action reviews and learning with honesty. Shifting that needle from blaming to learning. So now there's a powerful system, it's international, that this is shared across the entire aviation system worldwide through the cooperation of many countries. And generally speaking, aviation's become massively safer than it was before. I mean, in that same period of time, 15 years, over 500,000 people have died in car crashes in the United States alone.
Wow.
So flying is hugely safer than traveling in any other mode.
I can't leave you without asking you about focus and complexity. And you start off that chapter with a quote from Warren Buffett, which I love. The difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. Talk about focus and complexity.
Well, there's a trap, I think, in choice making. And that is, we tend to make a choice between A and B and then C and D and so on and so forth. And that's really piling it on. And what we don't do is to subtract effectively. And when we don't subtract effectively, we introduce more and more complexity into an organization. And I've got a little matrix that I apply with 4 quadrants. And in the bottom left-hand quadrant, there's a box called dogs. And the dogs are those products or activities that are growing less fast than the market. They're losing market share.
Yes.
And they're below the target profitability. The trouble with having a dog box that's so full is that it subtracts energy and attention from everything else we do. So I have a motto: subtract first, then multiply. Now, Peter Drucker actually was the one who jolted my thinking on this when he said, every 3 years, every product and every activity should be put on trial for its life. We need to have a hardwired process for doing it. Now, here the cautionary tale is General Electric.
Yes.
Which became a giant conglomerate over time. Very, very complex, business to consumer, business to business, business to government, and banking. And through its complexity, I think the market was asking, are you more valuable than the sum of the parts? And I don't think GE was responding in a convincing manner. It lost $500 billion in market value because of that complexity. So it then began to subtract, too little, too late.
Yes.
And now GE has embarked on a process of spinning off all of their businesses as independent entities, except one, aerospace. So the old GE, that conglomerate model, has died. And it died through complexity. And that complexity was self-inflicted. So it can be a very dangerous thing. The thing that I do regularly with organizations I work with is embark on this process of, okay, we're going to do a strategy, but subtract first, then multiply. That way you create focus. And Steve Jobs was brilliant at this. That's the counter example. I mean, he took his top 100 executives on a retreat every year. And after 3 days, he said, I want you to come forward with the 10 most important things we should be working on. And they offered the 10, he wrote them down. He crossed off 7, he left 3, and he said, we're going to work on these 3. The others are completely off the table. And through that very, very intense focus on the very few things that matter most, Apple became the most valuable company in the world, with a market value greater than the Russian economy. So now we've got GE killed itself through complexity, and we've got Apple flourishing through simplicity and focus.
Such a great example. All right, Willie, let me see if I can pull together some summary points from our conversation today. We first started talking about learning, and you talked about evolutionary science. It's a law, not a choice. And our ability to adapt, not our strength, is really what drives innovation and our ability to evolve, not just as a species, but organizationally. So we have to develop that capacity to learn continuously, and we have to adapt to the external environment because it doesn't adapt to us. And I loved your comment about inviting disturbances. Second main point, barriers to truth. Everyone else is biased except for us. So we have to monitor our own thinking. Self-awareness is the antidote. And then you laid out a few different barriers to truth in your book: confirmation bias, status quo bias, denial, and then siloed thinking. Does that sound right so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Well done. Good summary.
Thank you. Asking the right questions. It can fundamentally change our thinking, and then the outcome of an event, or in the case of the Revolutionary War, as the example you gave, it all began with reframing the question, which changed our thinking. So the power of questions, we talked about the military's after action review process and learning with honesty. And the shift here is from blaming to learning. And then finally, focus. And this is such an important part because I find that with most of our clients, this is so incredibly difficult. You've got a philosophy of subtract first, then multiply. We have to subtract effectively, or we add complexity to our business. And you gave these opposing examples of GE versus Apple, where Apple took that stance of really shrinking their product line when Steve Jobs came back to the business, and have since had enormous success.
It's a good summary.
Willie, thank you so much. We'll put some of these notes up on our episode page. And folks, if you've enjoyed this episode, Willie Pietersen, is that how I say your last name, Willie? Can you pronounce your last?
Yeah.
Leadership, the Inside Story is Willie's latest book. And we just touched on a few key points inside of his book. There's so many more places that we could still have gone in this interview. Willie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Sam.